Hello and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 592, The Artist of the Open Road, Part 2. We last left Utagawa Hiroshige, one of the greatest artists not just of his generation but all of Japanese history, having been turned down by the first master he asked to apprentice himself to, something I will always find at least a little bit funny, before finding that the second time was in fact the charm. And I should say here, there are really two stories about Hiroshige's origins, so to speak. The first and more common one is the one I told last week, that Hiroshige first approached Utagawa Toyokuni, the older of the two second-generation masters of the Utagawa school of ukiyo-e, but Toyokuni turned him down. He already had too many students, and hey, what were the odds this kid was going to turn out to be one of the most revered artists in Japanese history? But Toyokuni did see enough promise to recommend the boy reach out to the other Utagawa schoolmaster of this generation, the younger and slightly less prestigious Utagawa Toyohiro, who did take him. This again is the more popular version of the story, but there is another one I have seen out there and I don't know enough to know which one is right. The second version is that Hiroshige actually approached both Utagawa schoolmasters at the same time, and both of them told him to, in essence, piss off, but Hiroshige kept asking, and eventually Toyohiro was the one who caved in first. I don't know which one of these is true, although I confess I like the second one, that Hiroshige just pestered his way into becoming one of the most famous artists in human history. Regardless of which one is true, it was definitely Toyohiro who took the precocious kid on, and Toyohiro who gave him the artistic name he would become famous under. Utagawa, of course, because he was joining the Utagawa school, plus the hero from Toyohiro, and the shige from one of the names the young boy was using at the time. In the confusing world of pre-modern Japanese naming conventions, young boys would go through several different names over the course to adulthood and beyond, some personal, some public-facing. At the time, the future Hiroshige was going by the name Ando Juemon, and the Ju in Juemon can also be read as Shige, hence Hiroshige. Now, unfortunately, I can't tell you much about Hiroshige's training and how it went, because education during this time was a very private matter. Knowledge during the age of the Tokugawa shoguns was, in a way, siloed into the various schools of whatever discipline you were interested in. What I mean by that is, imagine you want to learn any skill set, from carpentry to swordsmanship during this time. You don't attend a publicly available trade school. They don't exist. You have to go to a specific master of a specific style who will then train you. And part of proving yourself to that master involves discretion. The allure of the school, of what the master had to offer, came in part from the secrecy, the scarcity of the knowledge. So you had to prove that you could protect that secrecy. Many schools included a so-called okuden, an inner teaching, that explained whatever the school was particularly famous for, a unique joinery system, a particularly devastating series of quick-draw sword techniques, a brushwork approach to painting a certain kind of scenery. Only the most devoted pupils gained access to this inner knowledge, and part of proving that devotion was proving you would protect the secrecy and exclusivity of it. So that means we don't exactly have Hiroshige's report card from art school to know how he did, or even necessarily what Toyohiro taught him. We do know, though, that Hiroshige moved up the ranks fast. Hiroshige officially became a student of Toyohiro sometime in 1811. I wasn't able to find the specific lunar month, unfortunately, but I can tell you that by the spring of 1812, he'd been given his artistic name of Utagawa Hiroshige. And that is usually something that happens when you have finished your training, meaning that Toyohiro felt this kid had gone from newbie to ready to do his own thing in somewhere between slightly under or slightly over 1 year. That's wild, though, I mean, he was also right given the rest of Hiroshige's career. You'd probably expect such an artistic genius to take the world by storm, but interestingly, Hiroshige didn't actually produce much after he finished his apprenticeship. We don't actually have a series of prints authored by him until 1818, 6 years after he was finished. And again, we can't really be sure why, but we have a pretty good guess: his day job. Remember, Hiroshige had a very important gig he'd inherited from his father, leader of a fire brigade in the Yaesu neighborhood. This is not exactly, in a city made of wood and paper, the sort of job that you want to half-ass, and it seems that it kept Hiroshige pretty busy. He did take that work very seriously. In 1818, he got a commendation from one of the shogun's most senior advisors, Okubo Tadazane, for his efforts in fighting a blaze in the samurai neighborhood of Ogawamachi. Of course, none of that left him a lot of spare time, and Hiroshige attempted to retire from his firefighting duties in 1823, presumably to further his art career. Unfortunately for him, his request was not granted because the son he offered to retire in favor of was 6 and arguably not really ready for the responsibility of make sure the nation's capital doesn't burn down. It wasn't until 1832 that Hiroshige was finally able to actually retire, and, not very surprisingly, it was also around that time that he actually started to, get famous. By the way, just a quick note about Hiroshige's personal life. He got married in 1816 to the daughter of another fireman whose name was Okabe Yuaemon. Unfortunately, we don't know the name of his first wife, which is not unusual given the gender norms of the period. By the 1800s, the notion, particularly among samurai families, that women were entirely private entities in their lives, and thus that even their names should be kept within the family, had developed a good amount of currency. The only thing I can tell you is the two of them had a son, Nakajiro, the aforementioned 6-year-old, and that this first wife died sometime in the late 1830s. Nakajiro, unfortunately, would also die pretty young, but we'll get more into that and Hiroshige's second marriage next week. Anyway, being a full-time fireman, being a family man, didn't leave Hiroshige much time in the 1810s to work on his art, so again, it's not until 1818 that we even have a published print series by him. Well, 2 of them actually. One, Furyu Itsutsu Karigane, or 5 Elegant Descending Geese, another, Keisei Sadakagami, or A Faithful Mirror of Courtesans. Despite the whole geese thing in the name of the first one, they're actually both part of the same genre of prints, one his master Utagawa Toyohiro was famous for, bijinga, or portraits of beautiful women. Indeed, for the first decade or so of his career, Hiroshige largely produced either these sorts of bijinga prints or prints of actors from the kabuki stage. These were also, not coincidentally, the 2 most common genres of ukiyo-e woodblocks for most of the history of the genre. Certainly, of course, a chance to show off your ability to produce an elegant figure, but also an example of the fact that people just like having pictures of hot folks around. I guess they're the Edo period equivalent of posters of famous actors or pinups of hot babes today. Many of these prints were so-called surimono, a term that literally just means printed thing, but which refers to an image that was privately commissioned rather than made for mass distribution. For example, you might commission a surimono to celebrate a new year. Many famous kabuki actors had them done for their most famous roles, or a group of poets might have a competition and then commission a surimono print related to the winning poem. Indeed, the first Hiroshige works we know of that weren't pictures of actors or hot ladies were surimono commissioned by a poet he was friends with, Hachijinte Kataki. Hachijinte was a master of kyoka, literally wild poems. These follow the same basic rules as tanka, the 5-7-5-7-7 poetic structure that gave birth to haiku and which has roots going back over 1,000 years, but kyoka are more satirical or vaguely sexual, or sometimes both. In this case, Hachijinte had made a bunch of poems using that most classic form of Japanese humor, the elaborate kanji pun, in this case around tazukuri, the candied anchovies often eaten at New Year's celebrations, and had hired Hiroshige to illustrate a few of his works. I mention this for 2 reasons. First, of course, it's funny to imagine one of the great masters of ukiyo-e, and indeed all of Japanese art, making a living drawing appetizers. And second, Hachijinte and Hiroshige would actually strike up a friendship, and until Hachijinte retired in the 1830s, he would often provide poems to accompany Hiroshige's illustrated work. Between this example, Hiroshige's ability to win over Utagawa Toyohiro into taking him on as a student, and his ability to convince Okajima Rinzai to teach him the fundamentals of Kano school painting that we talked about last week, it seems pretty clear to me that at least one part of Hiroshige's success was the fact that he was good at working with other people and convincing them that it was good to work with him. There's a bit of a life lesson in that, I suppose. Anyway, much of Hiroshige's early career was spent on this pretty standard fare for ukiyo-e, surimono for those who could afford the commissions, plus pictures of beautiful women, famous actors, and action scenes from their plays, the sort of thing that had a clearly established demand already, and which publishers could therefore be reasonably confident would sell. Interestingly, he didn't get that deep into another field of ukiyo-e where he did have pretty good connections. His teacher, Utagawa Toyohiro, was well known for working with publishers to give illustrations for popular novels called golkan, essentially a genre of book that took advantage of woodblock printing as a form to mix images directly in with the text. Alongside portraits of hot babes and kabuki actors, this was arguably Toyohiro's bread and butter, or I guess his rice and miso. He'd illustrated some 160 different novels from 1800 to 1820, so an average of 8 or so every single year. Because of the volume of illustrations required for one book, working on them was also a great way for an aspiring artist to get noticed by a publisher and pick up more lucrative contracts. But despite that fact, and despite the fact that his own master was famous for doing this work, Hiroshige never got that deep into trying to illustrate novels. He worked on a couple of them during this period of his career. He even worked with some pretty famous writers, like Ryutei Tanehiko, author of Nisei Murasaki Nakagenji, which was a very popular satirical work that was banned in the 1840s for being too immoral, as well as our old friend Jipensha Ikku on 2 of his books that were not part of the Hisakurige series, and thus less well known. He'd proven, in other words, that he could do this work, and gotten the chance to work with some very famous authors, but by the late 1820s, Hiroshige just stopped working on golkan novels, and never really came back to the genre in the future except to do the occasional title page for a new publication. Again, we don't really know why, but we can make a few guesses. First, of course, one suspects his official career got in the way of being able to spend the huge chunks of time required to do this kind of illustrating full-time. Between all the training and doing what was in essence night watch duty, night shifts looking for the signs of a fire, he didn't really get a lot of downtime if you were one of Edo's firefighters. And perhaps Hiroshige was also deliberately avoiding this kind of work because until he was officially retired, there was no point in diving headfirst into the sort of job meant to establish a reputation so you could work as a full-time artist. Indeed, beyond his own work, the debt he owed as a disciple of Utagawa Toyohiro also obligated him to chip in at Toyohiro's studio every so often, helping with background work, designing and creating new illustrations for his master. He just didn't have the time to aggressively pursue a career as a full-time artist. But, and I'm speculating here, it might also just be a matter of interest. As we'll see, Hiroshige had a very specific kind of image that he really liked to do, and it wasn't the kind of character action you see in a golkan novel. You see, Hiroshige loved landscapes. It's the sort of thing he's known for, his genre. He's a landscape artist. That's what grabbed him. But in the 1820s, that sort of work just wasn't commercial. Publishers didn't see a demand for it. Hiroshige did do some landscape series starting in 1825, one of famous places in Edo, another set around Lake Biwa northeast of Kyoto, but for the most part, he was unable to find a market for the sort of work that, judging by his late career, he very obviously wanted to do. There were always some buyers, but never a lot, so there were never that many publishers who were really pushing to find artists who would do it, and Hiroshige just couldn't make that work. So what changed that allowed Hiroshige to finally launch his career? Well, a few things. First, in the late 1820s, the 2 second-generation masters of the Utagawa school died. The older, Toyokuni, in 1825, the younger, Toyohiro, Hiroshige's master, in 1829. Hiroshige's own third generation was now in charge of the Utagawa school, and Hiroshige himself, probably if he hadn't been working full-time, would have had a shot at taking over Toyohiro's side of the lineage and becoming Utagawa Toyohiro II, but his work kept him from that. Finally, in 1832, he was able to retire in favor of his son, Nakajiro. He moved out of the firefighters' compound in Yaesu into a house nearby, and was able to devote himself to art full-time. At the same time, the understanding of what it was the people demanded from their art was starting to shift, thanks to a crazy old man who was mad about art. Because by 1830, the art world in Japan was dominated by one name above all others, a guy who'd come from basically nowhere to become one of the period's most celebrated figures, and one of the most famous artists in human history, Katsushika Hokusai. Now, even if you don't know the name, I guarantee you have seen at least one of Hokusai's images. As I mentioned in the first episode of this miniseries, the Great Wave off Kanagawa is one of the most reproduced images in human history, and honestly, the only works of art I can think of that would come close to challenging it in terms of fame would be like some European classic stuff from the Renaissance, maybe The Last Supper or the Mona Lisa. Hokusai's just that famous. And he was famous in his own lifetime, too. From the jump, people recognized this guy was unusual, a remarkable talent, both for his eye and, I guess, his performance, you might call it. Last week, for example, I told the story about Hiroshige entering a painting contest that was judged by the literal shogun, with his entry just being chasing a chicken around with its feet dipped in red paint, and then drawing a single blue brushstroke. And he won that contest. What I'm getting at is that, at least as I see it, Hiroshige understood art not just as a finished product, but as a performance that helped produce it. He cultivated this reputation very deliberately as a maverick artist who would do these wild and crazy things. But it worked, and as a result, Hokusai was the rarest of treasures, a man so insulated from the economic demands of working as an artist, who as a result could do basically whatever the hell he wanted with the confidence people would just be into it, because his name alone was enough to sell it. I guess the modern equivalent would be something like a blank check film director who makes like $1 bazillion on a new Avengers movie, and is thus able to go to studios and say, I am clearly marketable, so just give me a budget and get out of my way. And in 1830, Hokusai decided he wanted to do something a little unconventional for an ukiyo-e artist. He wanted to do landscapes. The result was Fugaku Sanjurokke, or the 36 Views of Mount Fuji, and honestly, it is a classic example of Hokusai just calling the shot and sinking the basket, because 3 of his best-known works are all from this series. The first, of course, is Kanagawa Oki Namiura, the Great Wave off Kanagawa, which I promise you have seen because, again, it is one of the most famous images in human history. The next is Gaifu Kaisei, Fine Wind, Clear Morning, this beautiful image of the rising sun shining onto Mount Fuji. And then there's Sanka Haku, the thunderstorm beneath the summit, with the peak of Mount Fuji emerging from this swirling mass of black clouds. They're all spectacular, and even if you are not an art person, so to speak, they're just moving, I think, is the best and only word. They're also important evolutions in the history of Japanese art. Hokusai was inspired to do them in part by the growing availability of a new ink that previously had not been available in Japan, the so-called Prussian blue. Why was he so excited by the color blue? Because Prussian blue, compared to a lot of the other pigments that existed at the time, was light-fast. It did not fade when exposed to light. Now, once upon a time, technically the ancient Egyptians had invented a synthetic, light-fast blue pigment, which we uncreatively call Egyptian blue, but during the Roman period, the knowledge of how to make that was lost. So the creation of Prussian blue was kind of a big deal. When it spread to Japan in the early 1800s, oh boy, people lost their minds. It became very faddish to put a lot of blue in basically everything, and even the famously fad-avoidant Hokusai was clearly inspired to give it a go. Most importantly, of course, the 36 Views of Mount Fuji sold like hotcakes, and publishers became convinced all of a sudden that there was in fact a market for landscapes out there. And it's worth noting that while Hokusai deserves a lot of credit for proving this, he didn't do so solo. As we talked about last week, there had been a growing interest in landscape ukiyo-e since the late 1700s. The first so-called meisho, or famous place images depicted in ukiyo-e, were usually brothels, but a growing interest in travel had helped drive a demand for landscape images of famous places, in the same way that today you might go to Tokyo Tower and get a poster of the cityscape. The demand for what were in essence souvenirs for travelers interested in a record of the places they visited had been there. Some of the Utagawa school artists before Hiroshige had even made decent money on landscapes, and the trend was, in retrospect, probably obvious for anyone who cared to look, but in the end, change is one of those things that happens slowly, and then all at once. And in this case, it took Hokusai looking at that slowly opening door and just blasting clean through it to really show there was demand here. And Hiroshige seems to have understood this. Again, Hokusai's 36 views of Mount Fuji hit shelves in 1830. Well, the first 10 images did. The publisher wasn't sure it would be a hit, so it took until 1831 to get the rest out, including a few special editions that were done just using the new Berol-Ei, or the Berlin Blue, that hot new synthetic Prussian color-fast dye. In 1831, Hiroshige, seeing Hokusai's landscapes sell well, about to retire from his work as a firefighter, no longer working in his master's workshop since Toyohiro had just died, was able to find a publisher for his own landscape series, Toto Meisho, or Famous Places of the Eastern Capital, Edo in other words. Famous Places of the Eastern Capital did pretty good numbers, but it was also very much a stock idea for a woodblock print series. Both Utagawa Toyoharu and Katsuhiko Hokusai had done their own versions. Buying souvenir images of a place you'd visited in Edo, or at least heard of, was a pretty steady business that ensured images of the capital always had a market. So here's where we have to stop for a second and talk a bit about tourism. Tourism wasn't technically legal under the rules of the Tokugawa shogunate. It wasn't like you could just decide, I live in the provinces, but I want to go see Kabukicho for myself just cuz, and up and do it. But there were ways around the rules. Maybe you were on a shrine pilgrimage and really wanted to go to nearby Hanazono Shrine or something. Or you could just circumvent the checkpoints where your travel papers would have been checked because those were well-known places with well-traveled paths around them for those who needed them, and there wasn't anybody riding the roads between those checkpoints doing the equivalent of like a highway patrol. And so tourist travel was not exactly hard to do either or restricted to just samurai. Plenty of businesses, in turn, existed to cater to travelers, from inns and restaurants to, of course, souvenir shops, including ones selling prints. It's pretty clear looking at the prints from Famous Places of the Eastern Capital that Hiroshige hadn't just been commercially enabled by Hokusai's success, but artistically as well. A few of the images from Hiroshige's series, such as Ryogoku no Ryoizuki / Evening Moon over Ryogoku Bridge, and Takanawa no Megatsu / Full Moon at Takanawa, have distinctly Hokusai-ish elements, let's call them that. For me, the most obvious is a subject that's actually fairly far back in the image with a foreground element, the bridge in the first, a flock of some sort of bird, I can never ID birds well in the second, that helps the main subject pop a bit more and give the scene a bit more of an action-oriented feeling. The old truism is that good artists borrow and great artists steal, and so in this case, let's just say there's a bit of an obvious influence, and hey, if you're going to be influenced by anyone, you could do worse than Katsuhiko Hokusai. And cribbing a bit of Hokusai's magic worked because from this point on, Hiroshige's career would have a pretty solid upward trajectory. In fact, the very next series he was able to work on would in many ways be his most famous and career-defining, but before we get there, we should talk about two more aspects of the period art market. First is the nature of Hiroshige's prints during this period, and especially a rather interesting phenomenon concerning them. There's actually multiple versions of several of these prints running around. The biggest differences between them usually have to do with what's called bokashi, the process that's used to create a graded fading effect either from light to dark or between colors. Basically, that's done during the printing process by hand applying the ink for the color or colors you're using in a gradation over the block, which means it's very labor-intensive to do. As a result, prints with bokashi were a lot more expensive, but they're also very dramatic looking, and of course, in the dog-eat-dog world of artistic competition, any edge is worth having. But the thing was, bokashi could be applied in different places in different ways, even across the same image, maybe a different shade of sky, or a tree that's shaded in one version but not another, and so on. It's hard to describe in audio, but I'll give an example or two in the show notes. And this raises a question, of course. Why are there different versions of these prints? Is it a matter of, say, Hiroshige suggesting during the collaborative printing process, hey, there are a few different ways you could do this? Was it a request by a specific patron who maybe liked the image but had a slightly different color in mind? Was it just something the publisher decided on? Because remember, this is not a system with modern copyrights. Once the images were in the hands of the publishers, they could change what was in them if they wanted to. We really don't know for sure. What we do know, though, is that Hiroshige had, let's call it a challenging reputation when it came to working with his publishers. I guess reputation isn't the right word. It's not like we have a letter from Sanoya Kihei, Nishimura Yohachi, or Moriya Jihei, or one of the other major publishers of this time, being like, God, this guy is annoying. But the numbers really speak for themselves. Over the course of his career, which, spoilers I guess, would go on for about 27 years after this point, Hiroshige worked with 30 different publishers. 15 of those collaborations would be one and dones. They would collaborate on one image or set of images and then never again. By comparison, particularly in the 1700s, most artists had worked with one publisher their whole careers. And in fact, of Hiroshige's 30 different publishers, there were only 3, the 3 I just name-dropped, Sanoya Kihei, Nishimura Yohachi, and Moriya Jihei, with whom Hiroshige had anything like a career-long relationship. And again, we don't know why he had so many publishers. We don't have, complaint letters from them or anything, but we do know that Hiroshige had a reputation for being exacting. He liked a lot of bokashi in his images, which is hard to do, it's expensive, it drives print costs up and thus returns down, and he tended to be very picky about the details in his images. It's not beyond reason to suggest that many publishers either just didn't like working with him or quite possibly just didn't have the money to do so successfully and execute his vision. Because here's the thing, the 3 publishers who all had that relationship with Hiroshige in the long term were all pretty big deals themselves. Sanoya Kihei had a famous shop right by Zuljoji near what's now Tokyo Tower. Nishimura Yohachi, he had a shop right by Nihonbashi in the center of the city not far from the shogun's palace. Moriya Jihei had worked with some of the period's other most famous artists, including Hokusai, and even worked for the shogunate on occasion as an official censor for images. They were all pretty big deals, is what I'm saying, and so maybe they were the only ones who could afford to deal with this crazy demanding artist who wanted the most expensive, most perfect version of everything. To be fair, it wasn't like Hiroshige was just annoying and pretentious, and that became very clear once he finished Famous Places on the Eastern Capital and started working on his new series, probably the most famous thing he ever did. Tokaido Goju Sansugi, or the 53 Stations of the Tokaido Road, is, despite the name, actually a 55-print series. One each for the 53 stations of the road, plus one print for Nihonbashi in Edo, where it begins, and one for the Sanjo Bridge in Kyoto, where it ends. The Tokaido was one of the uncreatively named Gokaido, or 5 roads, the major highways maintained by the Tokugawa shoguns, across the spine of Japan's main island of Honshu to link the shogun's capital of Edo with the far-flung provinces. The Tokaido was the most important of these roads by far. It was the main route connecting Edo to Kyoto and Osaka, respectively the ancient and symbolically important imperial capital, and the most important economic hub in the country after the capital itself. So linking those places was obviously important, and even today, the old Tokaido corridor is the most heavily trafficked thoroughfare in Japan, both via automobile and by the very first Shinkansen bullet train line in Japan's history, uncreatively called the Tokaido Line. And because it was so important even back in the day, the Tokaido Road was a major hub of travel and tourism. It's the setting, you might remember, of Jupensha Iku's travel comedy novel Hizakurige. As you might expect, there were also a lot of ukiyo-e images of the Tokaido Road by Hiroshige's time, including, of course, a series by Hiroshige inspired by Hizakurige, though this one's more about the act of travel, eating alongside the road, staying in an inn, that sort of thing, than specific locations. Now, the story behind the inspiration of Hiroshige's Tokaido series is a pretty famous one. That in 1832, he managed to finagle his way into being a part of the annual delegation sent by the shogun from Edo to Kyoto, there to present gifts to the Emperor of Japan to acknowledge the importance of the imperial throne. Ostensibly, the shoguns of the Tokugawa family served at the emperor's pleasure. In practice, of course, the emperor was so protected by his loyal servant from any distractions to the imperial line that for centuries by this point the emperors were basically disengaged from politics and largely irrelevant. Still, these annual gifts maintained the fiction of the shogun's deference, just enough to keep everything flowing smoothly. And again, the story is that Hiroshige went on one of these trips as a part of the procession bringing gifts to the emperor, but there are reasons to doubt that. For one, our oldest source for this origin story is not Hiroshige himself, but Utagawa Hiroshige III, one of his students. For another, why would a retired firefighter be worth a spot on a, despite its ceremonial nature, pretty high prestige trip? For a third thing, a good number of the images from places closer to Kyoto appear to have been cribbed from illustrated guidebooks that were available at the time. Again, not something unique to Hiroshige, nor was that considered unusual or unethical in a time and place where things like copyright and intellectual property were understood very differently. And for a fourth thing, did Hiroshige even have time to go to Kyoto? He was working full-time as an artist. He was trying to establish himself. Not just with this series, but others too. Just to give an example, in 1834, as Hiroshige was finishing the Tokaido series, he also put out something completely different, 8 Views of Lake Biwa, which is not quite as well known because it's a bit more derivative, I guess is the word. That subject, 8 Views of Biwa, was one of the stock subjects for all of the arts during the Edo period. The idea of it goes, of course, back to Imperial China, specifically the Song Dynasty 1,000 years ago when the artist Song Di did an 8-painting series of famous places along the Xiang and Xiao rivers, with each of the 8 locations supposedly being the most beautiful, so the thinking went, at a time of day. This particular painting trope, 8 views of a place, each one is best at a certain time of day, spread to both Korea and Japan, and in Japan the 8 views approach became associated specifically with Lake Biwa to the northeast of Kyoto. Katsukawa Shunsho and Utagawa Toyoharu had each done their own 8 views of Lake Biwa, as did Katsushika Hokusai. The prints in that series are impressive, of course. It's Hiroshige, of course they are, but I mention them mostly to note that Hiroshige, after he retired from firefighting and had the leeway to devote himself to art, did not show an inclination for half measures. He was a professional who worked at producing images full-time. A trip to Kyoto early in his career would have meant a multi-month journey away from his studio. We are more certain that he took some trips later in his career, but this specific one, not very well documented. I have reason to suspect that either he didn't actually go, or he followed the procession for the first few stations along the Tokaido Road, and then just use illustrated guidebooks for the rest. Because again, a lot of those images are pretty clearly lifted from illustrated guidebooks to these different regions, which would be odd if Hiroshige had actually been himself. But arguably none of this really matters. What matters is not if the images of the trip were real, but people responded to them. Almost immediately, 53 Stations of the Tokaido Road was a hit. As the poet Yomono Takisui put it, "These pictures make me feel as though I have traveled to the places myself and viewed them in person, with never a moment's fatigue." Nor was he the only one who felt that way. Tenmei Rojin, another famous poet, praised Hiroshige's talents by saying he, quote, "seems to place the landscape before our very eyes." Hiroshige had an eye for composition. He knew how to, as he put it in one of his later works, master drawing from life and combine that with style. We'll talk more about that style and about the career and legacy of the man who came to dominate Japan's art world next week. For now, that's all for this week. Thank you very much for listening. This show is a part of the Facing Backward podcast network. You can find out more about this show and our other shows at facingbackward.com, and you can support the network on Patreon. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week for the third and final part of this miniseries.